Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, so today we're exploring a seriously high-stakes moment in human history. I mean, just imagine being part of this massive, life-changing movement, right? And then suddenly, the visionary founder passes away. What happens the very next day? Do the followers stick together, or does the whole thing just instantly fall into chaos? Well, that is the exact dilemma the early Buddhist community faced. We're going to look at the monumental, honestly, almost desperate task of preserving the Buddhist teachings right after his passing. It's an incredible story of the absolute length his closest disciples went to just to make sure his legacy wasn't lost to history forever.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand the sheer panic of the moment, listen to the words of an old, kind of foolish monk, spoken literally just days after the Buddha's passing. While the vast majority of the Buddhist followers were paralyzed by overwhelming grief, this guy? He was thrilled. He actually said, "I am finally free. I will do what I want and stop what I don't." He thought, great, the strict master is gone, I can finally do whatever I want. It's crazy, right? But this singular moment completely establishes the immediate threat of anarchy. Without the Buddha physically there, the strict monastic rules, the precepts, were at immediate risk of just vanishing, completely replaced by complacency and personal desire.
So that brings us to our first major crisis, the passing of the Buddha.
The historical sources describe a deeply somber scene in the city of Kusinagara. When news of the Buddha's passing spread, the grief among his devoted disciples was just absolutely immense. The text described followers literally throwing themselves to the ground, weeping, crying out that the eye of the world had been extinguished way too quickly. But, amidst all this profound sorrow, the practical realities of the world were already pressing in. Following his passing, his body is wrapped in pure celestial cloth and cremated with fragrant wood. But get this. Immediately after the fires die down, a huge political crisis erupts. 8 different kings and clans show up with actual armies, ready to go to war over the Buddha's physical relics. To avoid bloodshed, a wise Brahmin intervenes and negotiates the division of the relics into 8 portions, while another takes the urn and another takes the ashes. This resulted in the very first 10 stupas, which are monuments housing these physical remains. But here's the catch. While the physical relics were distributed and secured, the community's leaders knew that the spiritual legacy, the actual teachings, were still incredibly vulnerable.
Which leads us directly to the next phase, the First Council and securing the teachings.
Now this is where Elder Mahakasyapa steps in. He was one of the absolute most senior, respected, and knowledgeable disciples of the Buddha. Hearing rebellious monks rejoicing over the Buddha's death, he realizes physical monuments just aren't going to be enough. If the rules and teachings aren't standardized immediately, the entire faith is going to collapse from the inside out. So he steps up as the authoritative leader and initiates this meticulous master plan. He doesn't just call a random town hall meeting. No, he selectively gathers 500 fully enlightened monks, arhats, who have absolutely perfected their understanding. He secures a perfectly safe, well-supplied location in the city of Rajagraha where they won't be interrupted by anyone. Then, he appoints the absolute best experts for the job. Elder Upali, renowned for his flawless knowledge of the monastic rules, or the Vinaya, and Ananda, the Buddha's personal attendant, to recite the thousands of discourses, known as the sutras.
And there is a profound emotional weight behind this gathering. When it was Ananda's turn to speak, he took the high seat to recite the discourses, and he began his recitation with this exact phrase. "Thus have I heard, at one time the Buddha was in." The source text tells us that when those 500 monks heard this phrase, they literally dropped to their knees and wept. They felt as though their beloved teacher was right there in the room with them again. This phrasing didn't just comfort them, though. It became the ultimate, timeless seal of authenticity for all Buddhist texts from that day forward. It's absolutely crucial.
But of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. During this council, a massive debate broke out. See, before passing, the Buddha had actually mentioned that the monks could choose to abandon the minor rules if they found them too restrictive. The problem? No one had asked him exactly which rules were considered minor. So Mahakasyapa drew a hard line. He argued passionately that dropping any rules would look like total corruption to the outside world. Rival sects would mock them. They'd say the disciples abandoned their discipline the exact second their master died, like a fire turning to smoke and just dying out. So for the very survival of the order, he declared that absolutely everything must be kept perfectly, the whole shebang.
And their extreme dedication to purity meant literally no one was above the law, not even Ananda, the most beloved disciple. During the council, he was actually made to publicly repent for 6 faults. And listen to what they considered faults back then. Accidentally stepping on the Buddha's robe while folding it. Failing to fetch clear water fast enough because passing carts had muddied the river. Or pleading for women to be allowed to ordain. I mean, if a revered figure like Ananda had to answer for these seemingly minor actions, it just proves how incredibly high the standards were set. It was a crystal clear message to the entire community: the rules are absolute.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit to our next section, 110 years later and the Second Crisis.
So the first council was a massive success. The teachings were secured, the monks were disciplined, the community thrived. But, human nature is tricky. What happens when the original generation, the ones who actually looked into the eyes of the founder, passes away? Well, the exact complacency that Mahakashyapa feared begins to slowly creep in. Just 110 years later, barely over a century, a massive institutional decay threatens to tear the monastic order apart. Just 110 years.
This second major crisis erupts in a prosperous city called Vaisali, and it revolves entirely around monks deciding that the old rules were just a bit too inconvenient for modern times. This is exactly how corruption starts, right? Not with some massive rebellion, but with small, everyday compromises. The monks in Vaisali invented 10 supposedly lawful exceptions to the rules. For example, while the Buddha strictly forbade accepting gold or silver, the Vaisali monks started walking around with a golden bowl, actively begging the public for coins. They started storing food overnight, claiming it was just salt for future use. They even bypassed the total prohibition on alcohol by drinking unfermented palm wine. They were modifying the rules for convenience and worldly wealth, directly corrupting the original Dharma that Mahakashyapa had fought so hard to protect.
Which brings us to the heroes of the story, the defenders of the Dharma, and the Second Council.
Thankfully, the true teachings were not left undefended. Elders Yasa and Ravada championed the resistance here. Yasa actually witnessed the Vaisali monks begging for money and immediately told the laypeople do not give it to them, explaining it was completely against the Buddhist teachings. And get this, in retaliation, the corrupt monks tried to excommunicate Yasa? No way, right? But Yasa stood incredibly firm. He traveled across the country to recruit allies, eventually finding Elder Ravada, a monk of unimpeachable integrity. Now, the corrupt Vaisali monks knew that if Elder Ravada ruled against them, they were finished. So what do? They attempt to bribe Ravada's disciples with expensive robes, fine shoes, and medicines, hoping the disciples would, influence their master. But the righteous approach won out. When Elder Ravada found out, he was furious. He absolutely refused to compromise, called out their behavior as foolish, and demanded strict adherence to the true teachings. The man literally could not be bought.
And this brings us to the triumphant climax and the resolution of the Second Crisis. Using their vast network, the Orthodox elders recruit allies from regions far and wide. They assemble exactly 700 fully enlightened arhats to act as a supreme jury. In a highly structured debate, Elder Ravada systematically dismantles the 10 unlawful practices one by one. For every single loophole the Vaisali monks try to present, Ravada points directly back to the specific rule recited by Upali 110 years prior, proving it illegal. It was a brilliant counterattack. The swift and absolute resolution extinguishes these bad practices entirely, preserving the purity of the monastic order once again.
So, what does this all mean for us today? It leaves us with a pretty profound question. Take a second to really think about it. Does the survival of great wisdom depend more on the brilliance of its founder or the unwavering discipline of the followers who come after? Through the First and Second Councils, we clearly see that strict adherence to the rules wasn't just, rigid bureaucracy for the sake of being strict. It was a profound act of devotion and, honestly, a necessary mechanism for survival. Without the unyielding integrity of disciples like Mahakashyapa, Yasa, and Revata, the Buddha's legacy might have just faded into a wisp of smoke. Thank you so much for exploring this incredible historical journey with me on This Explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.